Coming home to a fine for unauthorized use of sunlight reflecting off your dock. Not kidding. That's about how ridiculous things had gotten at Lake Meadows. One minute I was dreaming of peace and fishing beer in hand. Next I was being told by a woman with a clipboard and a superiority complex that I owed hundreds in fees, because my dock apparently had been smiling at the water wrong. I didn't get mad. I got legal. And then I got creative. If you're into petty power plays, HOA hysteria, and one man turning red tape into revenge with interest, welcome to my favorite real estate misadventure. Spoiler free, but let's just say it ends with me owning more than just my dock. A large red notice screamed from the cabin door, with the HOA logo stamped over the word violation like a death sentence. I pulled my Honda into the gravel driveway, camera bags scattered across the back seat. The official letterhead read Lake Meadows Homeowners Association in bold black letters, and the fine print made my blood pressure spike. $300 monthly dock fee, immediate compliance required. Failure to respond within 48 hours would result in legal action. I was still processing this nonsense when I heard the unmistakable sound of designer heels crunching across my gravel driveway. Marcus Bennett, I presume? The voice belonged to a woman in her early 30s, wearing wrinkled black slacks and a white button-down that looked like it hadn't seen an iron in weeks. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and she clutched a clipboard against her chest, like it was some kind of shield. Behind her stood two other people, a nervous-looking man in an ill-fitting suit, and another woman I didn't recognize. I'm Stella Hayes, president of the Lake Meadows HOA, and we need to discuss your violation of our community standards. Her tone was the kind of condescending you'd expect from someone who'd never worked a real day in their life, and her smile had all the warmth of a January morning in Minnesota. The way she emphasized president told me everything I needed to know about what kind of person I was dealing with. I held up the notice, trying to keep my photographer's eye for detail focused on the situation rather than my growing irritation. This says I owe $300 a month for a dock that's been here since the 1970s. My grandfather built this thing before your HOA even existed. Stella's clipboard trembled slightly in her hands, which struck me as odd for someone trying to project authority. The man behind her, who I'd later learn was Mark Sullivan, the HOA treasurer, shifted uncomfortably and kept glancing toward the lake like he was expecting someone else to show up. Something about their body language screamed coordination, like they'd rehearsed this little performance before arriving at my door. The age of the structure is irrelevant, Stella replied, her voice getting sharper with each word. Rules are rules, Mr. Bennett. Your grandfather's dead, and now you follow our regulations. The comment about my grandfather hit harder than she probably intended, but I'd learned long ago that the best way to handle bullies was to stay calm and observe. Through my camera lens, I'd captured enough human drama to recognize when someone was putting on a show, and Stella Hayes was definitely performing for an audience. Her constant glances toward Mark Sullivan, the way she kept checking her phone, and most telling of all, the slight tremor in her voice when she mentioned the dock regulations. None of it felt authentic. What's really going on here, Stella? I asked, pulling out my phone to photograph the notice. Old habit from years of documenting everything from wedding disasters to family feuds. Evidence first, emotions later. Because this whole thing feels like harassment over a dock that's never bothered anyone before. Stella's face flushed red, and she took a step closer, invading my personal space in a way that felt deliberately intimidating. You have 48 hours to comply with HOA regulations or face legal action. We're not running a charity here, Mr. Bennett. Mark Sullivan finally spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. Maybe we should explain the safety concerns, but Stella cut him off with a sharp look that could have frozen the lake in July. The third person in their little group remained silent, but kept staring at my cabin like she was appraising it for sale. Something about that look made my skin crawl, and I filed it away in my mental notebook of things that didn't add up. After they left, I stood on my porch for a long moment, watching their car disappear down the winding lake road. There was definitely more to this story than a simple dock violation, and Stella Hayes had just made the mistake of targeting someone who made a living paying attention to details. I decided to make a phone call to the one person who knew more about Lake Meadows history than anyone else still breathing. Gregory Harris answered on the second ring, his gravelly voice carrying the weight of 65 years and at least 40 of them spent on this lake. Marcus, good to hear from you, son. How's the photography business treating you? Before I could answer, I heard him chuckling. Let me guess, you've met our new HOA president, haven't you? The knowing tone in his voice told me this conversation was going to be more interesting than I'd expected. "Gregory, what do you know about dock fees and this Stella Hayes character?" I asked, settling into one of my grandfather's old Adirondack chairs. The silence that followed lasted long enough for me to wonder if the call had dropped. But then Gregory's voice came back, lower and more serious than before. "Son, there's something about that lake Stella doesn't want folks knowing. Meet me tomorrow morning at 7 and bring some coffee. We've got some talking to do." The morning mist was still rising off Lake Meadows when I arrived at Gregory's place with 2 steaming cups of coffee and a head full of questions that had kept me awake most of the night. His cabin sat on the North Shore, a weathered cedar structure that had witnessed more lake history than any building had a right to. Gregory was already waiting on his porch, ready for serious conversation. "Morning, Marcus," he said, accepting the coffee. "Beautiful day to talk about ugly business." We settled into matching rockers that creaked in harmony with the gentle lap of waves against his shoreline, and Gregory began painting a picture of Lake Meadows that I'd never heard before. "Your grandfather Frank wasn't just one of the original settlers here, son. He was the original settler. Back in 1972, when this whole area was nothing but undeveloped woodland and a natural lake that didn't even have a name, Frank Bennett saw something special." Gregory's voice carried the reverence of someone describing a sacred place, and I found myself leaning forward despite the early hour. "He bought the entire shoreline from the county for practically nothing, maybe $3,000 total, and then spent the next 5 years convincing other families to build here. Frank had vision, but more importantly, he had legal documents that gave him rights most folks today don't even know exist." The coffee was getting cold in my hands as Gregory continued his history lesson, but I couldn't bring myself to interrupt. According to him, my grandfather hadn't just purchased land, he'd secured water rights, mineral rights, and something called perpetual lake access that basically made him the unofficial king of Lake Meadows for as long as any Bennett owned property here. The HOA didn't exist until the late 1980s, and it was only formed to handle basic maintenance and keep the peace between neighbors, Gregory explained, his rocking chair keeping steady time like a metronome. "Your grandfather agreed to it because he thought community cooperation was important, but he never signed away his original rights. Those papers are probably still in Frank's files somewhere, assuming you haven't thrown them out yet." Janet Morrison used to praise the HOA. Now she leaned over during coffee and whispered, "Something's off, Marcus. This isn't the community I signed up for." Before I could respond, the sound of car doors slamming echoed across the water from the direction of my cabin. Gregory and I exchanged glances, and without discussion, we both stood up to get a better view across the lake. Even from a distance, I could make out Stella Hayes' distinctive silhouette, along with what looked like at least 3 other people congregating near my dock. "Speak of the devil," Gregory muttered, handing me a pair of binoculars. Through the lenses, I could see Stella gesturing animatedly at my dock, while a man in an expensive-looking suit took notes. Mark Sullivan was there too, hovering nervously in the background, and the mysterious third woman from yesterday was back, this time carrying what appeared to be surveying equipment. The group spent nearly an hour examining my dock, taking photographs, and having what appeared to be a heated discussion that involved a lot of pointing toward my cabin. Stella kept checking her phone and seemed increasingly agitated as time went on, while the man in the suit maintained the kind of calm demeanor that suggested he was accustomed to dealing with difficult people. When they finally left, they drove past Gregory's place slowly enough for us to get a good look at their license plates. The suit was driving a rental car with airport tags, which only added to the mystery. "Marcus," Gregory said after they'd disappeared around the bend, "I think you better find those papers of your grandfather's real quick. Something tells me this dock business is just the beginning, and Stella Hayes has bigger plans than collecting $300 a month from you." We spent another hour talking about lake politics, property rights, and the various characters who'd tried to stir up trouble over the years, but Gregory kept coming back to one central theme. My grandfather had been incredibly thorough about protecting his interests, and somewhere in his documents was probably enough legal ammunition to stop whatever Stella was planning. "Frank always said the key to winning any fight was making sure you knew more about the battlefield than your opponent," Gregory told me as I prepared to leave. He kept meticulous records of everything, every deed, every survey, every conversation with county officials. If Stella Hayes thinks she can push around a Bennett, she's about to get a very expensive education in local history. I spent the drive back to my cabin thinking about legal documents and wondering why I'd been so reluctant to dig through my grandfather's old papers. The truth was, going through his belongings felt too much like accepting that he was really gone, and I wasn't quite ready for that level of finality. But as I pulled into my driveway and saw fresh tire tracks near my dock, I realized that sentimentality was a luxury I couldn't afford right now. Stella Hayes had thrown down the gauntlet, and it was time to find out exactly what kind of weapons my grandfather had left me to fight back with. The basement smelled like cedar shavings and old paper, with that particular mustiness that comes from decades of lake humidity mixing with carefully preserved documents. My grandfather had been obsessively organized, with filing cabinets labeled by year and topic in his precise handwriting, but finding anything specific felt like searching for buried treasure without a map. After 2 hours of sorting through tax records, insurance policies, and correspondence with various county offices, I finally found what I was looking for in a manila envelope marked Lake Meadows Original Purchase Important, tucked behind a box of Christmas decorations. The deed inside the envelope was a revelation that made my hands shake as I read it. According to the official county document dated March 15, 1972, Franklin Bennett hadn't just purchased shoreline property. He'd bought water rights to the entire lake, mineral rights to the lake bed, and something called perpetual access and usage rights that essentially gave him control over everything from fishing to dock construction to boat launches. The implications were crystal clear. Every single dock, boat slip, and swimming area at Lake Meadows existed at the pleasure of whoever owned these rights. And according to my grandfather's will, which I found in the same envelope, those rights had transferred to me along with the cabin. I was still processing this bombshell when my phone rang, and Grace Roberts' name appeared on the screen. Grace was one of the few HOA members I'd actually met before this whole mess started, a real estate lawyer who'd always seemed reasonable during the handful of community meetings I'd attended over the years. "Marcus, I hope you don't mind me calling," she began, her voice carrying a strange mixture of professional caution and personal concern. "I was at yesterday's emergency HOA meeting, and there are some things about Stella's dock campaign that don't add up. Do you have a few minutes to talk?" The timing of her call felt too convenient to be coincidental, but after the morning's discoveries, I was ready to trust anyone who seemed willing to question Stella's authority. "Actually, Grace, your timing is perfect. I just found some documents that I think you should see." Grace arrived at my cabin within an hour, carrying a briefcase that suggested this wasn't going to be a casual conversation. She examined my grandfather's deed with the kind of focused attention that comes from years of reading legal documents for a living, occasionally making small sounds of surprise that grew more frequent as she worked through the fine print. "Marcus, this is extraordinary," she finally said, looking up from the papers with something approaching awe. "Your grandfather didn't just have water rights. He essentially owned Lake Meadows in its entirety. Every property owner here, including Stella, technically holds their land, subject to the restrictions and allowances outlined in this original deed." The weight of what she was saying hit me like a cold wave, and I found myself sinking into my grandfather's old leather chair as the implications began to register. "Does this mean what I think it means?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. Grace nodded slowly, her expression mixing legal fascination with what looked like genuine sympathy. "It means Stella Hayes has no authority to charge you dock fees, and more importantly, it means you have the legal standing to challenge every decision the HOA has made regarding lake usage." She paused, organizing her thoughts like the lawyer she was. "But Marcus, if you decide to assert these rights, you need to understand that you'll be taking on not just Stella, but potentially the entire community. Property law disputes can get very ugly, very quickly, and there's no guarantee how your neighbors will react when they realize their lake access depends on your goodwill." The warning was fair, but after Stella's performance yesterday, I was past the point of worrying about hurt feelings. We spent the next hour developing what Grace diplomatically called a strategic response plan, though it felt more like plotting revenge with legal documentation. Rather than immediately confronting Stella with the deed, we decided to let her continue digging her own hole while I quietly established my legal position with the county. The beauty of letting Stella make the first move is that she's essentially building our case for us, Grace explained, her professional demeanor warming into something that almost resembled excitement. "Every aggressive action she takes, every fee she tries to impose, every threat she makes, it all becomes evidence of harassment when we finally reveal your ownership status." The plan appealed to my photographer's instincts for timing and composition. Sometimes the perfect shot required patience and positioning rather than immediately clicking the shutter. My hands shook. I reread the deed twice, then slammed the envelope shut. This wasn't just leverage, it was checkmate. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of phone calls to county offices, emails to property record departments, and the kind of bureaucratic navigation that makes most people want to move to a desert island somewhere. But by evening, I had official confirmation that my grandfather's deed was valid, current, and legally binding, which meant I wasn't just another lake property owner getting bullied by an overzealous HOA president. I was, in the most literal sense possible, the person who controlled access to the lake that gave our community its name and value. As I sat on my dock that evening, watching the sunset paint the water in shades of gold and crimson, I couldn't help but smile at the irony. Stella Hayes thought she was dealing with some pushover photographer who'd roll over and pay whatever fees she demanded. Instead, she'd picked a fight with the one person in Lake Meadows who had the legal authority to shut down her little power trip permanently. The question now wasn't whether I could fight back, it was how far I was willing to go to protect what my grandfather had built. Grace's warning about community backlash was already proving prophetic, as I'd noticed several neighbors giving me strange looks during my evening walk around the lake loop. Word traveled fast in a community of 30-some households, and I suspected Stella was working overtime to frame me as the troublemaker who was threatening everyone's peaceful lake life. But as I looked across the water toward the lights of other cabins and houses, I realized that maybe it was time for this community to remember who had made their little paradise possible in the first place. Tomorrow, I decided, would be the day Stella Hayes learned that some fights aren't worth picking, and some people aren't as helpless as they appear. The morning brought another surprise in the form of two men in security uniforms blocking the entrance to the Lake Meadows Community Road, complete with an official-looking barricade and clipboards that seemed to be standard equipment for anyone working with Stella Hayes these days. A new sign read, "Residents Only," by order of the HOA president, as if I was some trespasser on my own family's land. My photographer's eye immediately registered the absurdity of the scene. This was a public access road that had served the community for decades, and now it looked like the entrance to some kind of military compound. "Sir, I'm going to need to see identification and proof of residency," one guard announced, extending his hand toward my window with practiced authority that felt more like theater than genuine security. I handed over my driver's license, which clearly showed my cabin address, but the guard studied it like he was examining evidence in a criminal case. Behind him, I could see Stella Hayes emerging from a black SUV parked near the community mailboxes, wearing the same wrinkled outfit from our previous encounters, but now accessorized with a self-satisfied smile that made my teeth clench. "I'm sorry, sir, but we have instructions that you're not permitted access to the community pending resolution of your HOA violations," the guard said, handing back my license with what I assumed was supposed to be a regretful expression. The whole performance felt rehearsed, like they'd been practicing this confrontation before I arrived. In the presence of several neighbors who'd coincidentally chosen this moment to check their mail, suggested that Stella wanted an audience for my humiliation. "Excuse me?" I said, making sure my voice carried far enough for the growing crowd of onlookers to hear clearly. "You're blocking me from accessing my own property because of a dispute over dock fees?" The absurdity of the situation was almost entertaining, except for the fact that I could see my neighbors whispering among themselves and taking pictures with their phones. Some of them looked confused, others seemed embarrassed by the spectacle, but a few were nodding in approval of Stella's heavy-handed tactics. The guard shifted uncomfortably, clearly not prepared for pushback, and I noticed him glance towards Stella for guidance. "Ma'am, he's asking about accessing his property," he called out, loud enough for everyone present to hear that he was just following orders rather than making independent decisions. Stella approached with the confident stride of someone who believed she held all the cards, flanked by Mark Sullivan and another man I didn't recognize wearing a suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payment. "Mr. Bennett, you received official notice of your violations and chose to ignore HOA requirements," she announced, her voice pitched to carry to the assembled crowd of neighbors. "Until you comply with community standards and pay the required fees, your access to common areas is suspended pending legal resolution." The way she emphasized legal resolution made it clear this was as much about public intimidation as private property disputes. But what struck me most was how her hands were shaking, despite her confident tone, and how the expensive suit guy kept checking his watch like he had somewhere more important to be. Instead of arguing or creating a scene that would give Stella more ammunition for her campaign against me, I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures of the barricade, and most importantly, the impromptu community gathering that had formed to witness my supposed disgrace. Old habits from years of wedding photography had taught me that documentation was often more powerful than confrontation. And something told me these images would be useful later. "That's fine, Stella," I said loud enough for everyone to hear, keeping my voice calm and reasonable despite the adrenaline pumping through my system. "I'll be in touch with my attorney about this situation very soon." The mention of legal representation caused a visible shift in the crowd's body language, and I noticed several neighbors exchanging uncertain glances that suggested maybe Stella's version of events wasn't the whole story. As I drove away from what felt like the most ridiculous checkpoint this side of a war zone, my phone rang, with Grace Roberts' number appearing on the screen. "Marcus, I just heard about the security guards from 3 different neighbors," she said before I could even say hello. "Please tell me you didn't do anything that Stella can use against you in court." I filled her in on the morning's events while driving toward the county courthouse, where I'd decided it was time to make my grandfather's deed a matter of public record that even Stella's expensive suit friend couldn't ignore. "Actually, Grace, I think Stella just handed us the perfect opening," I said, pulling into the courthouse parking lot. "Because I'm pretty sure blocking access to a public road without proper authority is going to look really bad when we reveal who actually owns the lake." The county clerk's office was one of those government buildings that seemed designed to make simple tasks feel impossibly complicated. But the elderly woman behind the information desk took one look at my grandfather's deed and immediately directed me to someone who could help with property rights documentation. Within 2 hours, I had filed official notice of my ownership claim to Lake Meadows, requested a survey of the property boundaries, and initiated the process of establishing new usage regulations for what was, according to legal documents dating back 50 years, essentially my private lake that I'd been generously sharing with the community. The clerk assured me that all interested parties would be notified within 72 hours, which meant Stella Hayes was about to receive some very interesting mail from the county government. On the drive back to Gregory's cabin, since my own was apparently off limits until further notice, I found myself thinking about power dynamics and how quickly they could shift when people discovered that their assumptions about authority weren't based on actual legal standing. Stella had built her entire campaign against me on the premise that she represented legitimate community interests against my selfish violations of reasonable rules. But what happened to that narrative when the community discovered that their lake access depended entirely on the goodwill of the person she'd been harassing? As I pulled into Gregory's driveway, I realized that tomorrow was going to be a very interesting day at Lake Meadows. And for the first time since this whole mess started, I was actually looking forward to seeing Stella Hayes' face when she realized just how badly she'd miscalculated. The phone started ringing at 6:30 in the morning, and by the time I was fully awake, I had 7 missed calls from different Lake Meadows residents and a text message from Grace Roberts that simply read, "Check your email immediately." The county's notification letters had apparently been delivered yesterday evening, and word was spreading through the community faster than gossip at a high school reunion. My email inbox contained everything from confused questions to angry accusations to one particularly memorable message from a neighbor who wanted to know if I was planning to charge admission for lake access like some kind of aquatic theme park. But the most interesting communication came from Stella Hayes herself. A formal request for an emergency community meeting scheduled for that evening, with an agenda that mentioned addressing false claims regarding lake ownership and protecting community interests from individual harassment. Gregory's coffee was particularly strong that morning, which was probably good since I suspected I'd need all the caffeine I could get to handle whatever Stella had planned for the evening's entertainment. "She's panicking," he observed, reading through the email chain that various neighbors had forwarded to both of us. "Look at the language she's using, false claims and individual harassment. That's not the confident tone of someone who thinks they're in the right. That's someone scrambling to control a narrative that's slipping away from them." He was right, and I found myself wondering what kind of research Stella had done in the 18 hours since receiving the county's notification. If she'd been thorough, she now knew exactly how precarious her position had become. If she'd been sloppy, tonight's meeting was going to be even more interesting than I'd anticipated. I spent the day working on a wedding photo edit, trying to maintain some semblance of normal life while my phone buzzed constantly with calls and messages from Lake Meadows residents who suddenly wanted my opinion on everything from dock maintenance to fishing regulations. The most surprising call came from Nate Carter, a local blogger who covered community events and small-town politics for several regional websites. "Marcus, I've been following this HOA situation, and something about Stella Hayes' approach doesn't pass the smell test," he said, his journalist instincts clearly engaged. Would you be willing to go on record about what's been happening? Because I think there's a bigger story here than just dock fees and property disputes. I agreed to meet with him before the evening meeting, partly because I wanted the real story documented, and partly because I suspected Stella's version of events was going to dominate the narrative if I didn't get ahead of it. Nate turned out to be exactly the kind of reporter small communities needed. Thorough, skeptical, and genuinely interested in uncovering the truth rather than just generating controversy for clicks. We spent an hour at a coffee shop in the next town over, going through everything from my grandfather's original land purchase to Stella's escalating harassment campaign, and I could see him connecting dots that even I hadn't fully appreciated. "Marcus, have you looked into who that guy in the expensive suit is?" he asked, scrolling through photos on his phone from what appeared to be previous HOA meetings. "Because I ran his license plate through some databases and he's connected to Lux Resorts. They're the company that's been buying up lakefront properties all over this region for development projects." Suddenly, Stella's aggressive campaign against me made perfect sense, and I realized the dock fees were never really about community standards or safety violations. The community center was packed by the time I arrived for the evening meeting, with more residents present than I'd seen at any gathering since my grandfather's memorial service. Stella had positioned herself at the front of the room with a presentation setup that included charts, graphs, and what appeared to be architectural renderings of some kind of development project. Mark Sullivan sat at a folding table nearby with financial documents spread out in front of him, while the expensive suit guy, who I now knew worked for Lux Resorts, stood against the back wall with the kind of confident posture that suggested he was used to these kinds of community presentations. The energy in the room felt electric with tension, and I could see neighbors clustering into groups that seemed to represent different opinions about the evening's agenda. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Stella began, her voice carrying artificial warmth that couldn't quite hide the underlying stress. "We're here tonight to address some concerning developments regarding property rights and community governance that could affect every single family at Lake Meadows." Behind Stella, a giant poster showed a luxury resort rendering right where my grandfather's dock stood, now labeled V Marina. But what struck me most was how she kept glancing toward the Lux Resorts representative, and how her talking points seemed designed to justify some kind of change that she hadn't actually explained yet. When she finally got to the part about modernizing our community infrastructure and embracing development opportunities that could benefit everyone, the pieces of her puzzle finally clicked into place. The architectural renderings she displayed showed Lake Meadows transformed into a luxury resort community, complete with a hotel, spa facilities, and what appeared to be a golf course where several current homes were located. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have an unprecedented opportunity to partner with Lux Resorts in creating a destination that would not only preserve our beautiful lake, but make it profitable for every current resident," Stella announced, her voice gaining confidence as she warmed to her sales pitch. The room erupted in surprised murmurs, and I could see the exact moment when several neighbors realized that Stella's campaign against me wasn't about HOA violations. It was about removing obstacles to a development deal that would fundamentally change everything about Lake Meadows. I stood up slowly, making sure I had everyone's attention before speaking. "Stella, before we discuss resort development, I think everyone here deserves to know about the county notification you received yesterday." The room went completely silent, and I could see Stella's face flush red as she realized her carefully planned presentation was about to be derailed. According to legal documents dating back to 1972, my grandfather, Franklin Bennett, didn't just own a cabin at Lake Meadows. He owned the water rights, mineral rights, and usage rights to the entire lake, which means every dock, every boat launch, and every swimming area here exists because my family has allowed it for the past 50 years. The silence that followed felt like the moment before thunder, and I could see understanding dawning on faces throughout the room as people realized the implications of what I'd just revealed. The explosion of voices that followed my revelation made the community center sound like a stock exchange during a market crash, with neighbors shouting questions, accusations, and demands for explanations, all at the same time. Stella Hayes stood frozen at the front of the room, her presentation materials scattered and forgotten, while the Lux Resorts representative had gone pale and was frantically typing on his phone. I remained standing, waiting for the chaos to die down enough for rational conversation, but it quickly became clear that rational wasn't on tonight's agenda. Grace Roberts finally stood up and called for order, her lawyer's voice cutting through the noise with professional authority that somehow managed to restore a semblance of civilized discussion to the proceedings. If Marcus is telling the truth about these ownership rights, called out Janet Morrison from the middle of the room, then what does that mean for our property values, for our ability to use the lake? Her question sparked another round of heated discussion, with some neighbors directing anger toward me for disrupting their peaceful community, and others turning their frustration toward Stella for apparently misleading them about the development opportunity. But it was Gregory Harris who cut through the noise with the kind of clarity that comes from decades of watching small-town politics unfold. Folks, the real question isn't what Marcus's rights mean for us. It's what Stella was planning to do with our community without bothering to tell us the truth about who actually owns the lake. Stella finally found her voice, though it came out higher and more strained than her usual commanding tone. "This is exactly the kind of disruption I was trying to prevent," she said, gesturing toward me like I was some kind of invasive species. "Marcus Bennett has been violating community standards since he inherited that cabin, and now he's trying to use some 50-year-old paperwork to avoid taking responsibility for his actions." Her attempt to regain control of the narrative might have worked if she hadn't spent the first half of the meeting trying to sell everyone on a resort development that would have displaced half the community. The expensive suit from Lux Resorts was edging toward the exit, clearly recognizing that this particular deal had just become significantly more complicated than anyone had anticipated. I didn't say a word, just placed the deed copy on the podium and watched as neighbors leaned in, eyes wide. For 50 years, my family has maintained these water rights while allowing everyone free access to the lake. We've never charged fees, never restricted usage, and never tried to profit from what legally belongs to us. But apparently, while I was being accused of violating community standards, certain people were making deals to sell access to something they didn't actually own. The room's energy shifted again as people began studying the documents and whispering among themselves about implications they were only beginning to understand. Mark Sullivan, who had been silent throughout most of the evening's drama, suddenly stood up with papers of his own clutched in his shaking hands. "I need to say something," he announced, his voice barely above a whisper but somehow carrying clearly through the room. "Stella asked me to prepare financial projections for the Lux Resorts deal 6 months ago. The commission structure they offered her was worth $850,000 if the project moved forward." The silence that followed his confession was deafening, and I could see the exact moment when everyone in the room realized that Stella's campaign against me hadn't been about community standards at all. It had been about removing the one legal obstacle to a development deal that would make her rich, while destroying the community everyone thought she was protecting. Stella's face went through several colors during Mark's revelation, settling on a shade of red that suggested her blood pressure had reached dangerous levels. The resort project would have benefited everyone here, not just me. Property values would have increased, jobs would have been created, and Lake Meadows would have become a destination instead of just another small community that nobody cares about. Her desperate justification only made things worse, as neighbors began connecting the dots between her harassment campaign against me and her secret negotiations with developers who saw their homes as obstacles rather than community assets. The meeting devolved into smaller groups of heated discussion, with some neighbors demanding Stella's immediate resignation, while others peppered me with questions about my intentions for the lake rights I'd inherited. Grace Roberts managed to restore enough order for us to schedule a follow-up meeting the next week, but it was clear that the community dynamics at Lake Meadows had fundamentally shifted in the span of a single evening. As people filed out of the community center, I noticed that several neighbors who had been giving me suspicious looks for the past week were now approaching with apologies and requests to discuss the future of lake access under more reasonable terms than anything Stella had proposed. But Stella Hayes wasn't done fighting, and as the last of the neighbors headed to their cars, she approached me with the kind of desperate determination that makes people dangerous when they feel cornered. "This isn't over, Marcus," she said, her voice low and filled with something that sounded more like threat than disappointment. "You think you've won something here tonight, but you have no idea what you're dealing with. I still have cards to play, and you're going to regret making me your enemy." The way she said it made my photographer's instincts kick in, and I found myself studying her expression for clues about what kind of final move she might be planning. Whatever it was, I had the feeling that the real battle for Lake Meadows was just beginning. The envelope from the Environmental Protection Agency arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by certified mail with the kind of official stamps and seals that immediately make your stomach drop. regardless of what's inside. According to the formal complaint filed 3 days earlier, my dock was allegedly violating federal water quality standards, creating environmental hazards that threatened the entire Lake Meadows ecosystem, and operating without proper permits that apparently should have been obtained decades ago. The documentation was impressive in its thoroughness, complete with photographs of my dock, water quality readings that suggested contamination, and a list of potential fines that could total more than $50,000 if the violations were confirmed. But what made my blood boil wasn't the absurdity of the charges. It was the signature at the bottom of the complaint form, where Stella Hayes had identified herself as a concerned community member reporting environmental crime. The EPA investigation notice included a timeline that would shut down all lake activities for the next 6 to 12 months, while federal inspectors conducted their review, which meant every boat launch, swimming area, and dock at Lake Meadows would be off limits pending their findings. My phone started ringing within hours of the news spreading through the community, with neighbors who had been sympathetic to my position suddenly questioning whether fighting Stella was worth destroying everyone's lake access for an entire year. The pressure was unlike anything I'd experienced since this whole mess started, and for the first time, I began wondering if maybe Stella had finally found a way to force me into surrender. Grace Roberts requested an emergency meeting at her office downtown, and the grim expression on her face when I arrived suggested that the EPA complaint was even more serious than I'd realized. "Marcus, I need to be completely honest with you about what we're facing," she said, spreading the complaint documents across her conference table. "Environmental Protection Agency violations are federal charges that carry criminal penalties, not just civil fines. If they find even minor infractions at your dock, you could be looking at personal liability that would bankrupt most people." She paused. "Stella is essentially offering you a deal. Drop your lake ownership claims and she'll withdraw the EPA complaint before the investigation gets serious. It's extortion, but it's legal extortion, and fighting it could cost you everything." The meeting lasted 2 hours, with Grace walking me through various legal strategies and their associated costs, but every option seemed designed to benefit lawyers more than lake owners. By the time I left her office, I felt like I was drowning in regulatory complexity that made Stella's simple extortion offer look almost reasonable. As I pulled into the community center parking lot for another emergency meeting, I had almost convinced myself that maybe backing down was the responsible thing to do for everyone involved. The community center was packed again, but this time the energy felt desperate and angry, focused on finding someone to blame for the EPA investigation that threatened everyone's property values. Stella had positioned herself at the front with the confident demeanor of someone who believed victory was finally within reach. "Ladies and gentlemen," Stella began, "we're here tonight because one person's refusal to respect community standards has put all of our homes at risk. But I'm prepared to offer a solution that protects everyone's interests if we can reach a reasonable agreement." I stood up slowly, looking around the room, at neighbors whose property values and family memories were genuinely threatened by the federal investigation that Stella had triggered. For a moment, I seriously considered accepting whatever deal would make this nightmare end for everyone. But then I noticed Nate Carter in the back corner, his laptop open and his expression suggesting he'd discovered something important. "Before we discuss any agreements," I said, making sure my voice carried clearly, "I think everyone deserves to know the full truth about this EPA complaint." Nate Carter stood up, his journalist credentials giving him a natural authority that commanded attention even in a room full of people desperate for answers. "Folks, I've spent the past week investigating the EPA complaint against Marcus's dock, and what I found is going to surprise you," he announced, pulling up documents on his laptop screen. The complaint was filed using falsified water quality data, photographs that were digitally manipulated to exaggerate environmental damage, and statements attributed to community members who deny ever speaking to EPA investigators. The room erupted in surprised murmurs, but Nate wasn't finished with his revelations. More importantly, I discovered that Marcus Bennett contacted the EPA 6 months ago to report potential environmental threats from the proposed Lux Resorts development project. The federal investigation that Stella is using to pressure Marcus was actually initiated by Marcus himself to protect Lake Meadows from commercial development. The silence that followed Nate's announcement was the kind that precedes earthquakes, and I could see understanding dawning on faces throughout the room as people realized how completely they'd been manipulated. Stella's confident expression dissolved into something approaching panic, while the few remaining neighbors who had supported her aggressive tactics began shifting uncomfortably in their seats. "That's impossible," Stella said, her voice cracking with desperation. Marcus is lying to protect himself from legitimate environmental violations. But her denials carried no weight against Nate's documented evidence, and when Grace Roberts stood up to confirm that she had copies of Marcus's original EPA communication, Stella's last hope of controlling the narrative finally collapsed completely. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, standing up again with a sense of calm that I hadn't felt since this whole mess began, "I have an announcement about the future of Lake Meadows that I hope will restore the trust and community spirit that we've all lost over the past few weeks. Instead of using my grandfather's lake rights for personal profit or petty revenge, I'm establishing the Lake Meadows Community Trust, which will transfer ownership of water and usage rights to a community-controlled organization that represents everyone's interests rather than individual property claims." The response was immediate and overwhelmingly positive, with neighbors who had been ready to crucify me just minutes earlier now applauding a solution that protected their lake access while preventing future development threats. The paperwork took several weeks to complete, but by the end of the month, Lake Meadows had transformed from a community torn apart by property disputes and development schemes into something resembling the cooperative spirit my grandfather had envisioned when he first invited neighbors to share his lakefront paradise. Stella Hayes resigned from the HOA in disgrace and put her house on the market within days of the EPA complaint being withdrawn, while Grace Roberts was elected as the new community president, with a mandate to establish transparent governance and reasonable usage policies. The Lux Resorts representative never returned my calls, and I heard through local real estate channels that they'd moved their development focus to communities with less complicated ownership histories and more cooperative local leadership. 6 months later, I was sitting on my dock with Gregory, watching the sunset paint Lake Meadows in golden colors. The community boat launch that we'd built with volunteer labor was hosting its third family fishing tournament. Grace Roberts had successfully negotiated reasonable insurance rates for all lakefront property owners, and Nate Carter's blog had gained enough following to make him a legitimate voice in regional development discussions. A group of kids painted a wooden sign, "Lake Meadows shared not sold." Gregory smiled. "Now that's a better legacy than profit. Sometimes the people who try to take everything away from you end up giving you something much more valuable, the chance to build something better together."
That's it for now from QA Stories. Make sure you're subscribed and the bell's on. The next story might just top this one.